Gamification, game-based learning, and game as text. So this is an area of considerable academic and professional interest to me, and I'm just going to make a short video explaining what I think the three core differences are between these three terms, and give you a bit of the details of how these three things are different and how they may look different and how they may manifest differently in your classrooms. So just a quick definition off the top of my head in terms of complexity. Game as text is basically substituting a textbook or a piece of prose or a story or a film for a video game. So in game as text, the game is consumed as an object and then the learning happens around that. So the analysis of the game or the explanations that go on top of the game are where the learning takes place. Game-based learning is where the game is the actual tool where the learning takes place. So the teacher may add things to the game or explain concepts that were exposed within the game, but the core learning is driven from the game itself. So the key thing for game-based learning is that the game needs to be very specific to the skill being used. So for example, if you're teaching world history generally, and you're teaching civilization as a small part of that, that is game as text, because civilization is providing some ideas that you then tease out into your unit. Whereas for game-based learning, the game is the actual tool, so it needs to be typically more targeted, shorter, and more specific to the content you are teaching. So for example, for game-based learning, it might be a series of maths games where the core concepts being taught are exactly the same as what would have been taught in a traditional or textbook manner, but they're gamified, to use a phrase that will confuse you, in a certain way to make it more engaging. And then lastly, gamification, which I believe is the most complicated of the three. Gamification is where the very experienced and the very experience of school is gamified to become more game-like. And this is done including multiple elements of what makes up a game rather than just one in game-based learning. So in terms of duration, game as text, usually focused on a unit or an extended period of time, but not over an entire year due to the reasons I said earlier. For game-based learning, it's typically just one unit or a specific mini lesson or one lesson at most. For gamification, when it's done really well, it needs to have sort of some kind of a narrative structure or some sort of reason or explanation for what's happening in the class, and therefore it needs to be at least a unit, half a year, a term, or the whole year. In terms of the classroom environment for game as text, it's a little bit more digital, less books, more computers. For game-based learning, you would hope the class would be a little bit more engaged and it would be a little bit more fun. Whereas for gamification, the entire environment should be different in some way. Students are interacting differently, they're behaving differently, and they're completing different types of work, or at least at the very base level, there is some sort of guiding principle or narrative that goes over the top of these ideas. In terms of student behavior change, for game as text, hopefully the students are more interested and engaged with the text. For game-based learning, again, hopefully they're more interested and more excited about the activity they're completing. Whereas for gamification, what you're looking for is long-term behavior change. And this will depend entirely on the person designing the gamification of their class or their process or their education system or whatever it is. But it will depend on them what behaviors they are trying to promote. And for this, the gamification of business aspects are entirely relevant here. So if you think of a credit card company, they want you to use their credit card as many times as possible. For a reward card, they want you to shop as much as possible. And so these are actually changing the behavior of shoppers rather than just making it a little bit more fun. And that is, of course, the goal of gamification. Where does the burden rest for each of these? So for game as text, the burden is heavily on the shoulders of the developer or the person making the game. For game-based learning, it's on the person designing that aspect of the game, which as well as the teacher who needs to deliver it and keep students on task. And of course, if the game is developed by the teacher, the onus is on the teacher to create that game. For gamification, the burden rests quite heavily on the teacher themselves. And of course, the goal would be also to have student helpers serve various roles within the gamified class. But ultimately, the burden rests on the teacher, and this is a significant difference between game as text and game-based learning. Okay, so for each of these three sections, what is the object? So for game as text, of course, the object is the text or the game being accessed by the students. For game-based learning, the object is the game or the activity which has been included one or more aspect of gamification into it. So for example, times tables is the activity, The game is complete as many timetables as quickly as you can to appear on a leaderboard. So that's one additional game mechanic which improves, in theory, the activity from the old worksheet perhaps. And then it might also include other elements like graphics and some basic instruments of gameplay that make it a little bit more interesting. So maybe the game pretends that they're shooting the multiplication rather than just watching it or typing it or writing. Whereas for gamification, the object is the entire school, the entire class, or the group of students that you are working with. So the actual object being changed is the behaviors of the students, the behavior of the teacher, and the behavior of the way that the classroom actually functions. So the focus of each of these three, game as text, the focus is of course the game or the text. Game-based learning, the focus is on engaging students and making things more interesting. Whereas for gamification, the focus is on behavior and changing the way that students view and interact with this course content of a school. So each of these three things are opposed to different things. So game as text is opposed to boring old canonical classic texts. Game-based learning is opposed to boring lessons where the students are bored and have to listen to a teacher. And gamification is aimed at getting students to reconsider and reframe their understanding and their relationship within the class and in their relationship to their peers and to the school. So that sounds super complicated, but basically gamification is aiming to make those students who don't normally succeed at school have a different way into accessing their class through the form of it being gamified. In terms of the amount of game elements in each of these, game as text does have game elements, but they're all isolated in the game as text and it doesn't sort of flow out into the rest of the classroom. For game-based learning, the game concepts will typically be singular or a small range of them, but typically not including narrative as a generalization. Whereas for gamification, the game elements or the elements that make up a game need to be multiple. So it might have narrative, it might have a leaderboard, it might have scores, it might have experience points, it might have armor, it might have all sorts of things that are combined into making the gamified classroom a thing. So lastly, what are each of these things similar to? So game as text is similar to playing games at school. Game-based learning is similar to a flash game, an app, or what is commonly termed a casual game, which is a generally offensive term for quite a simple game with quite simple mechanics. Whereas gamification is sort of your AAA big blockbuster game that has many people working on it, but in the case of gamification, it's just one teacher and as many student helpers as they can recruit, trying to help out to maintain quite a complicated system within their classroom. Alright, so if you've watched this all the way through, I would love to hear what you think the distinctions are between these three things. This is just my understanding of it and how I conceive of it in my brain, but it's not necessarily true. I'd love to hear you argue with me about it.